Hello, thank you so much for joining our video session for today. We are going to be speaking about gun violence prevention with our panelists. We have Gary Klein from Klein Consulting here. We also have Greg Jackson, who is the founder of Community Justice Action Fund. I'm Shivani Choksi. I'm the CEO of Impactionable, and I'm joined here with two other teammates, Ms. Sukanya Anantanarayan, and we have Mairead Peters on the call as well. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm actually going to just speak a little bit about today's topic and what it's going to be covering. And then if our panelists want to add anything additional to their bios, I'm happy to, it'll be great to hear from them before we get into the discussion. So essentially, in this event, we know that the US has seen an epidemic of gun violence in the past several years. People are shocked, afraid, and angry at politicians and gun lobbyists for their lack of action to protect the people. How can we protect our communities and limit incidents of gun violence? What can we do to make politicians take action to prevent gun violence? Why have there been little changes in federal legislation to prevent these tragedies? How can we save lives? These are some of the questions organizations and American citizens are asking across the country on a daily basis. We're hosting a panel of advocates who have dedicated their missions towards understanding and aiming to prevent gun violence in their communities across the nation. We will speak to a diverse set of panelists about the causes of gun violence and the various actions we can take to support our communities and bring about change. We will also, if Greg is up for it, we can hear a little bit about his personal story in surviving gun violence and how this inspired him to take action. We will also discuss reframing the narrative surrounding gun violence, in that it's not a crime crisis, but rather a health crisis. So we're joined here today with two panelists. Gary Klein is the research fellow at the Violence Policy Center and has been a consultant for Everytown Law. He is a longtime consumer advocate and litigator who is responsible for a variety of gun safety and gun violence prevention projects at the Office of the Massachusetts Attorney General. He published a blog on gun safety, which can be found on gunaccidentjournal.net, and his full biography is available on his website, gkleinconsulting.net. Greg Jackson is the executive director of Community Justice Action Fund. He's a community organizer, political strategist, and issue advocate. Prior to becoming the organization's executive director, Greg served as the national advocacy director for 2 years. In this role, he worked with communities, elected officials, community leaders, and impacted residents to advocate for proactive and preventative solutions to end gun violence. Greg has led the effort to build political power through electoral participation, spearheading the 2020 Elect Justice campaign that mobilized over 1,000 volunteers and connected with over 1.6 million voters across the country. So I'm really happy to have our panelists here for today. Thank you so much for joining. So let's just get started in the discussion. Our first question is, what is your personal stance on gun control? In other words, what are your own theories of change regarding gun control? Greg, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I hope you guys can hear me okay. I want to just apologize for reporting from my car. I've had a family health issue, and so some folks are in the hospital here. So I'm actually just outside chatting with y'all. And I do apologize if I have to leave a little bit early because of that. As far as gun violence, what we as community justice realize is that gun violence for too long has been treated as a crime problem. And in response to that, we've only seen crime control strategies implemented. And if we look at what crime control strategies do, frankly, they focus really aggressively on sentencing, law enforcement, access, and control whereas a public health approach focused more on people-centered strategies. How do you address the root causes, the risk factors, and really help those who have been most impacted by violence? And so for us, we actually take a public health approach to gun violence. We believe that the way that we reduce violence includes addressing access to firearms, but that is not the sole approach. The primary approach is how do we help people who have been most impacted by violence, understanding that it is a disease, it is a health risk crisis, it is something that spreads based on your exposure to. So how do we help people who are navigating that trauma from gun violence? How do we help survivors, help victims? And then most importantly, address the risk factors that lead to a violent conflict and the root causes that created those risk factors. So our approach is a little bit different. You know, for us, it's not all about background checks. It's not all about banning assault weapons. It's more about dealing with the demand that leads to the supply of guns that in our communities and in our countries. And so that's really our approach. And frankly, we've seen multiple cities who have stepped up and taken a more public health approach to reducing gun violence, and they've actually seen results. And so we think that that's frankly the solution to how we address this crisis, just like the opioid crisis, and just like COVID-19, frankly, looking at this as an all of government, people-centered, health-focused approach on dealing with trauma as the primary challenge and not just the access to the firearm. So I'll pass it back to Shivani.
Thank you, Greg. And I know that, you said something critical when you were discussing your own theory of change, which was, America treating gun violence as a crime crisis and not a public health crisis. Gary, I know that you also agree with the statement. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own theory of change? I think you're on mute, my friend. Yeah.
So sorry, my family was in the kitchen making noise. So before I jump into the question, I wanted to say that in a small group like this, I'm quite comfortable if people put their hand up with comments or questions as I'm speaking or as different topics come up. I think that would be fine in this context. So I would welcome that. I first want to say that, I agree with everything that Greg said. My response to the question more generally is that we can't treat gun violence as if it's a single problem. We have to treat it as a combination of problems. There's obviously a problem with guns on the streets being used in violent encounters. That's only one part of the gun problem. There's also gun suicides. The guns are way too accessible to folks with problems, temporary depression and other mental health problems, and are far too often used to facilitate a suicide, where if the gun hadn't been accessible, the person would remain alive and get treatment. And third, we have a gun safety problem. We have a problem where guns just aren't made safe enough. And I think the most obvious example of that is that we have a problem with safe storage. And gun owners far too often leave their guns accessible, meaning that either that they get stolen and they get into the pipeline for trafficking and transferred to people who we would otherwise be able to prevent from having a gun. But they also get into the hands of children and other unauthorized users. And so there is never a day that goes by where there isn't a child who finds a loaded gun and accidentally fires it, either killing themselves, killing a sibling, killing a parent, killing an innocent bystander. And so that gun safety problem is something we also have to think about and address. I completely agree with Greg that we have to intervene in different and creative ways in communities to prevent violent encounters with guns. My own approach, in addition to that, is to think a little bit about what we can do to make guns safer more generally. And again, I'll go back to that same example. To the extent we're able to focus on safe storage, locking guns up rather than leaving them around, that is in many ways a way to deal with the safety of the gun. We aren't going to ever be in a position in this country to take away all the guns that are already out there. There's already more guns in the United States than people. And so I think one goal for the community is to advocate and ask for legislation that makes those guns as safe as possible where they are. And for the most part, what that means is locking it up, unloaded in a safe or with a gun lock that isn't easy for a child to break into, and to keep it away from dangerous situations.
Thank you both. Those are really, I know that both have shared a little bit more about what it means to keep guns away from communities or people that may, accessibility is just a huge issue as well. I know that Greg and I were speaking earlier when we initially started talking, and a part of CJ Actions Fund's mission is to speak about homicides that ultimately had to do with gun violence in Black and Brown communities. So what are the impacts on policing and even incarceration in our BIPOC neighbors when it comes to gun violence and gun preventions? There's certain communities that are targeted more in person, but some of these crimes are also underreported in the news. We see a lot of crimes that are happening due to mass shootings, primarily in white neighborhoods and white communities, compared to crimes that are happening every day in some of our Black and Brown communities. So maybe, Greg, is that something that you would be able to speak about?
Yeah, so that's a huge point for us. We struggle with this because the act of violence is a crime, but a major challenge is that people will see homicides in Black communities and assume that Black communities are criminal or that crime is prevalent. And when you look at statistics, it is not aligned. It is not aligned that way, right? So specifically with Black homicides, 70% of Black homicides in America are not connected to another felony. Let me just say that one more time. 70% of homicides in the Black community are not connected to another felony. So despite what you watched on Stars, despite what you saw on the 5 o'clock news, statistically, violence is not a result of a robbery, theft, some type of gang war. 70% of it is interpersonal conflict between people who do not have a criminal record, right? And so what we're seeing in the Black community is that's really the definition of community violence, is interpersonal conflict between two people who know each other, who maybe aren't family, but they're in an altercation that goes too far. And that's 70% of the homicides. But yet, when you look at the media, all you see is yellow tape. All you see is police lights. All you see is cop cars. All you see is police jackets lined up, right? And what we're dealing with in our community is this constant reinforcement or criminalization of violence in our communities, and not recognizing that these are interpersonal conflicts that could happen on a college campus, they could happen in a hospital, they can have it happen in they can happen in any situation, but it's not necessarily criminal activity is leading to these conflicts. And so the media has been warping the perspective on what violence is in our communities. And what's happened is because of that warping, we've seen the response warp too. We've seen communities that are saying, oh, there's a lot of crime in my community because they had a homicide. They'll say, we had a homicide, there's a lot of crime, we need more police. But when you actually look at the homicide, maybe it was two people at a club that got in a fight that got out of hand, and both of them were in college. Like, that doesn't necessarily align. And so that's warping the public response. And then ultimately it's warping the political response to where mayors are feeling the pressure that homicides are up. So we got to crack down harder on guns. We got to crack down harder on crime. And frankly, it's failing. If you look at what happened during the COVID-19 epidemic, it's probably the perfect example, because every major city, we've seen crime decline. We've seen robberies decline. We've seen drug sales decline. We've seen every form of crime decline, but we've seen a 35% increase in homicides. And in the Black community, we saw a 39% increase in homicides. And so how does every form of crime or criminal activity decrease, but homicides are increasing? To me, that's a I'm about to curse. That's a huge, like, flashing light that this is not just a crime problem. And yes, I like to use curse words. Sorry, Impactionable. But it's a huge indicator that this is not about crime. And if we only take crime approaches, yes, we'll reduce burglaries. Yes, we'll reduce carjackings. We'll reduce break-ins. We'll reduce assaults. We'll reduce a lot of those things. But that's not going to reduce the gun violence crisis that we have, because frankly, a lot of what's happening is not based on criminal activity. Frankly, what we've seen, the biggest alignment of what's happening is trauma. Okay, so there's a study done by the Violence Prevention Center that studies Black homicides every year. And they found that 30% is connected to another felony. Only 11% of homicides are connected to known gang activity, only 11%. And only 4% are connected to diagnosed mental health issues. So what does that tell you? It tells you that a lot of the buzzwords we're hearing, mental health issues, gang violence, criminal activity, are not statistically aligned with what's happening when we look at gun violence. And so that all reinforces, frankly, why we believe that this is a public health crisis. And the more that we keep pushing law enforcement, sentencing, restrictions, controls, access, strategies to it, we're going to continue to fail. And it is not going to, we may deter crime. You know, if you lock up 40 people in one neighborhood, you might deter crime for a year or two, but we're not going to end gun violence until we actually start addressing the risk factors and root causes that lead to that. And frankly, the one thing that has been connected to most folks, either being a shooter or survivor, the most common indicator has been their exposure to violence. The likelihood of someone after being shot again or killed or becoming a shooter is 40%. 40%. So it's much likelier that a survivor of gun violence has a future interaction with gun violence than someone who has a felony offense. I'm gonna say it one more time. It's more likely that a survivor of gun violence will be impacted by violence again than someone with a felony offense. But if you look at the strategies that are being implemented, it's so hyper-focused on criminal activity, and it's not focused on those who have been directly exposed, impacted, and traumatized by violence. And so I struggle with the whole policing piece, because frankly, I think we spend too much time talking about policing in connection to gun violence, understanding that they are the reactive approach to violence. And they're frankly one of the least effective approaches. So we have to focus more on what are the proactive approaches, what are the trauma-based approaches, what are the hospital-based approaches, what are the therapeutic-based approaches, what are the educational-based approaches, what are the housing-based approaches, what are the labor-based approaches. All of those have much better statistic results than law enforcement. But yet every time we talk about gun violence, I get questioned about police violence. And no offense to you, Shivani, but I just want to flag that we have to figure out how to shift America's mentality a little bit to think about this truly as a public health crisis, and think about what all forms of government have to do, and not just zero in on law enforcement. Because frankly, they're doing, in a lot of cities, love them or hate them, in a lot of cities, they're trying their best, but they cannot do this. The best law enforcement entity in the country cannot successfully end gun violence, because it's not a problem they can fix, in my opinion. I'll pass it back to you.
So I want to step in and agree completely, and provide an example of how the problem actually gets made worse by the way policing and prosecutions get handled, particularly in communities of color, and that is the focus on illegal gun possession. What happens is that the response of many prosecutors and police departments is to identify people who are in illegal possession of a gun and prosecute them rather than intervene to try to protect them and protect against the violence that might come in the future. And so what happens when people are prosecuted in communities of color is that they end up in prison or in the criminal justice system. Many people get branded with a felony, making it hard for them to find jobs in the future, making their lives much more difficult, making them much more desperate, making them in many ways more likely to feel like they need to carry the gun around in future. And really what should be going on is when someone is picked up with an illegal gun, plainly the gun should be confiscated, but more importantly, there should be a meaningful intervention from a public health perspective for that person to try to get at their root cause of them feeling like they needed to acquire the illegal gun, and to address whatever issues that might have led them to use the gun in an inappropriate and violent way. And it obviously affects communities of color more because if you look at the pattern of where stores are located in communities, it is much more likely that you're going to find a store that can make a legal gun sale in a white community than in the community of color. And so people really often feel like they have no choice but to acquire the gun from a trafficker, and that puts them in jeopardy of the criminal prosecution that really could impact the rest of their lives.
And let me jump in on that because Gary hit some really good points. So when I worked in the DC office of neighborhood safety, there was a young brother there, Julius. Julius has spent 8 years in prison for illegal firearm possession. And he was there he was in a program, a violence prevention program with us. And I took Julius out to lunch. And I said, Julius, man, what's going on? Like, what's your story, bro? I just asked him straight up, what's your story? Just at lunch. How you doing? Where you come from? How'd you get here? Just like most of us do for lunch. Julius said, yeah, I got locked up for firearm possession, but what people don't recognize is what led to that point. He said, I got robbed twice. I got robbed twice at gunpoint. And he has 2 kids. And Julius grew up in the foster home system. So he grew up not knowing his parents. And because of that, frankly, he had a very strong passion to be a good father. So for him to try to protect his children, he had full custody of his 2 kids. He got robbed at gunpoint twice. And the third time he called the police, and the police slammed him on the ground, put him in cuffs, and thought he was the aggressor. He called the police, was arrested in front of his kids, right? Arrested in front of his kids as if he was the aggressor. And after that time, he then decided to get a gun to protect him and his family and his 2 kids. And he was caught with that gun illegally because it's so hard to get a gun in DC. You have to go through 4, 5, 6 layers, which frankly, he should have went through those layers. He knows that. We all agree. But that process was hard, and it was easy for him to just buy it off of someone else than to go through all those hoops. And he was caught with the illegal gun and incarcerated and almost lost custody of his children. And so I'm sitting here with Julius and I'm thinking, man, we are judging Julius. We are thinking Julius wants to harm someone, that Julius wants to commit a crime, that Julius has a gun to harm or hurt people. When in reality, Julius suffered through being a victim twice, called to police for help. It failed. And he took matters into his own hands. And that's what landed him in jail. And in our communities, I will just say, I've heard hundreds, if not thousands of stories like Julius's, where people feel unsafe. They feel like there's no one in their corner. There's no one to protect them. And they are dealing with real threats. They are dealing with real desperation. They are dealing with real concerns, like so many Americans are. And they pick up a gun. And again, I think it's not the right thing to do, but it's a very practical thing to do. And as opposed to trying to incarcerate our way out of this or cracking down hard on the Juliuses of the world, I think we need to be just as aggressive on why does Julius feel like he needs to pick up a gun. right?
Well, his choice was a lot more rational than a white guy in the suburbs who thinks he needs a gun to protect his family. It's he had a legitimate basis for thinking he and his family were unsafe, whereas in the white community, many people feel unsafe for reasons that have to do, as far as I'm concerned, with nothing but paranoia.
Nothing but paranoia. I want to point one more thing out to you guys. If y'all look at Duke University Law Center, they did a study on sentencing for illegal gun possessions in the Midwest. Please look it up. I don't have it handy, so I'm outside the hospital. But please look up Duke Law illegal firearm possession study. And they found that in Chicago, people are being incarcerated at levels of violent crime for illegal possession. So if I get caught with a firearm illegally, I'm being charged as if I was trying to kill somebody, or charged as if I attempted to kill somebody. So we are watching this huge surge of incarceration that's happening. It started in Chicago. I'm sure it's in other places, but there's not enough people studying it or focusing on it. But we have to be very careful of cracking down on the possession of a firearm without really holding the true villains accountable. And then to me, I think that's the manufacturers, that's the traffickers, and that's our failed government systems that's failing to keep communities safe. Because just like in the suburbs, Gary said, people are buying guns out of fear based on what they watched on TV, what was on their social media, or what they see on their street. And it's ridiculous that someone in Chicago can get 20 years and someone in Indiana can be celebrated for doing the same thing.
So we do have one question that I'll read, and then we can move on to or I'll follow along that track, because I do have a question kind of with the juxtaposition between, you know, people having this immense fear of crime and wanting to reduce crime and violence, but then also on the same token wanting to have their Second Amendment rights and wanting to be able to have a gun. But let me just ask this question first, but keep that in mind so I don't lose the train of thought. So the question was directed towards you, Gary. Can you give us an example of a jurisdiction that handles illegal gun possession the way you recommended, by confiscating the gun and then applying public health analysis and treatment?
I don't know of a jurisdiction that on a blanket basis is offering mental health assistance to people who acquire guns illegally. And the best I can say is that some of the violence disruption programs, the projects that are starting to gain traction, is focused in that direction, and where they work the best, there is a partnership between the program and local law enforcement authorities, so that instead of referring people into the criminal justice system, they're referred to violence disruptors for what seems to me like more rational treatment. I also think it's fair to engage in some self-criticism of the gun violence prevention community here, because I think some of us are conflicted and do like the focus on preventing illegal possession and do like the law enforcement because there's a belief in the community that keeping guns out of the hands of violent people is the best way to address gun violence prevention. And I think we have to re-examine that and consider the other better options if we want to disrupt cycles of violence.
I want to respond to Ms. Peters. What I've noticed is that most people are afraid of crime and they don't even know what the crime stats are. Most of the time, they're afraid of the perception or the fear or the I don't know what the right word is. It's more the
possibility and the unknown.
The possibility of crime. And that paranoia is real, but that's not, we shouldn't be building policy off of paranoia.
And it's not
Right.
well-informed paranoia either, because so much of that is marketing by gun manufacturers. They do encourage people's paranoid beliefs by insisting that you have to have a gun in order to avoid victimization.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. And I can't even tell you how many friends I've gotten arguments with over, oh, I need to get a gun to make me safe. I don't know if I shared it. I don't think I shared this with y'all. I'm a survivor of gun violence. I've been shot. Okay. I was shot in April 2013. That's the only reason, not the only reason, but the main reason I got pulled into this movement. And I'm going to tell you right now, from anyone who's been shot, who's physically been through that experience, having a gun is not going to save you. The moment it happens so fast, whoever has to jump on you wins. And I hate to say it that way, but it's a very absolute quick interaction. This is not the movies. If I had a gun on me and I tried to have a shootout with the guy that shot me, he would have shot me in the chest or the face and I would have died, right? The fact that I evaded saved my life. And that's like 98% of situations is evasion is your best protection, not strapping up and fighting. This is not a John Wayne. This is not born supremacy. Like, that's not how it plays out. But people buy guns because they think, oh, if someone gets in my house, I can shoot them. No, if they break in your house and you sleep, you're done. Your best chance is to get out. I kind of went on a tangent here, but my point is, what Gary kind of alluded to is that concept, that idea that having a gun makes me safer, that having a gun keeps me protected, that having a gun makes me secure. I can protect my family. That is a manufactured marketing strategy by a multi-billion-dollar industry. Multi-billion-dollar industry. One of the biggest industries in our country, okay? In America, we are known for making cars. That's why everybody drives cars. We're driving SUVs. We're driving pickup trucks with nothing to lift, nothing to haul. Guns and gun manufacturing is a major business in our community. They are literally marketing that to us through our media, through our video games, through Call of Duty, through what we see on TV. If you go, I dare you, go through Netflix and just scan through and think about how many times you see a firearm in the main picture for Netflix movies. All of this is being marketed to us. And I think for too long, we have thought that, oh, no, that's just the way of life, or that's how it's be. No, this is the American obsession with guns that we are living in. And it's not like this in other countries. It's not like this in their other communities. And unfortunately, their focus is profit, not making you safer. If we actually were trying to make our homes safer, we would be investing in security systems. If we actually wanted to make our homes safer, we would get a dog. A dog is statistically a better approach to keeping you safe from someone invading your home or harming you than a firearm. So every human in America should have a dog. But no, we don't have 390 million dogs. We have 390 million firearms. And so I just want to really reiterate what Gary said. There is a big business pumping this into the blood of Americans all over the country. And they're selling you crime, but they're also selling you that this is the only solution when statistically it's flawed. And the risk greatly outweighs the ability of the firearm to protect you. And I have a firearm because I grew up on a farm. I have a firearm for hunting purposes. But in no way in hell do I think that firearm is going to protect me if someone breaks in my house. That is not the smartest way to move when you are dealing with the threat, and that is very statistically sound. So anyway, sorry for that rant.
That's all right. I got to talk to my two cats, though, because I don't think they're doing a damn thing to make me safer.
That's because they're cats. That's because they're cats.
Because they're cats, right?
Cats don't care about you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like we are disrupting the structure that Shivani wanted to use, but let me just say while we're focused on manufacturers, and to think about this from the shooter side, the guy who has the gun and is using it aggressively. One of the problems from that manufacturers encourage is they make guns easier and easier to fire. And so what they're doing is they're taking off all of the safety features that at one time made guns reasonably complicated to fire. And so because so much gunfire is based on an impulsive decision, the fact that manufacturers reduce the trigger pull, so you barely have to touch the trigger these days to fire a gun, and the fact that they've taken off on most guns what we used to have, which is some form of a manual safety where you'd have to release the safety before the trigger could even be pulled, means that instead of making two conscious decisions, one to release the safety and one to pull the trigger, now those people who are using guns impulsively can fire them more easily. And I think that a lot of the impulsive violence and some of the suicides would be prevented simply by making it harder to pull the trigger on a gun.
No, thank you. And I appreciate the free-flowing conversation, because that's what sparks discussion in the first place. So I appreciate that. We do have a question in the chat. There's someone that's thinking about Julius's situation, as well as the fact that communities and people of color are typically the ones that end up disproportionately prosecuted for illegal possession. Their question is making guns harder to obtain legally actually counterproductive, and will it also incarcerate more people of color?
So let me address that, because I've been on the regulatory side. I worked for 5 years at the Attorney General's office here, and have thought a little bit in the context, at least, of Massachusetts law about the things that we've done to make guns harder to get. I think the answer is no. I do think I am in favor of really heavy duty structural protections up front, both for gun licensing, for gun registration, and for background checks. And I think the reason for that, and the reason that it's important, is that we have to do some sorting to make sure that we're not facilitating people who shouldn't have guns getting guns. And this is an area where that is particularly important in the context of mass shootings and school shootings. And I think we have a responsibility as a society not to make it easy for people who shouldn't get a gun to get a gun. On the other hand, I also at the same time think that people who subject themselves to the full range of comprehensive background checks, whatever community they're in, they should get a gun. And I think based on discrimination, what we've done is we've made it especially hard in communities of color for people to get guns. And while at the same time, we're making it easier in white communities and in states where there are relatively few people of color.
I just want to build on that. I agree with Gary for the most part. I think the big thing that we have to do, if we really care about equity in this situation, is we have to crack down on the bad actors on the manufacturing, the selling, and the trafficking side. Giffords, actually, if you look up Giffords, they did a study on gun dealers that are selling crime guns or guns used in crimes. And they found that less than 2% of gun dealers are responsible for 80% of the legal guns. But yet these individuals, they're not being shut down. They're open today. They're probably selling guns right now. They're not getting fined. They're not getting arrested. They're not going to jail. They're not being held accountable for what's happened with those guns as they flow out of their communities. And they're not being held accountable for working around the background check system and the official systems. And so I think the solution is not necessarily making guns easier to access. I think it's shifting the accountability structure to be less harsh on those who have a gun illegally, but more harsh on the sources of those guns, whether that's traffickers, whether that's dealers, and in some places, manufacturers. I'm so inspired by the families of Sandy Hook and Newtown, how they were able to sue Smith & Wesson and receive fundings for the damages of the loss of their children. But imagine if every community devastated by gun violence had the same power, right? If they were able to put pressure and put accountability on the manufacturers for pushing guns into their communities that don't have safeties, like Gary said, that don't have the same type of safety measures or restrictions, that have gotten to the hands illegally or have gotten to the hands of someone who built it from a ghost gun strategy. Like if communities suffering from gun violence had the power to hold the manufacturers, the shippers, the dealers, the Amazons of the world more accountable, I think that would drastically shift the pendulum around gun violence. So I think that's how we do it. You know, let's start thinking more upstream. And we already do this, and this is all part of a public health approach, just to circle back, because we do this with the opioid crisis, right? Now, with the crack crisis, crack cocaine crisis, if you had crack, you going to jail. Opioids, if you have opioids, okay, we'll send you to rehab. You need treatment. And then we crack down on who got the opioids there, who manufactured opioids, where was the factory, who was the prescriber, who was the pharmacist, right? That's a public health approach. If we took the same public health approach that we're taking with opioid crisis and applied it to gun violence, I really think the pendulum would swing pretty aggressively, because a lot of gun dealers would shut down their doors and do something else. And a lot of gun manufacturers will start to be more accountable, because these guns are not growing on trees. They're being pushed and shipped into these communities. And I think that's the real crisis. So anyway, that's all I wanted to ask that.
So I think you made an interesting point, and kind of leads into the next question I wanted to ask you both, which is, you talked about the target being on the individual that is illegally purchasing the gun, rather than going after the sellers of the guns. And so, first of all, why do you think that is? Do you think it's just kind of part of this paranoia that is existing? And secondly, where do you see progress, or what is progress in that? What does that mean to you, and what would that look like, even in that instance? I mean, you kind of explained it in that instance, but like in other instances, like, why do you think it is that the individuals are being targeted rather than the institutions, and how can that be amended, and how can we amend, some of the other issues that have been discussed?
Why do you think it is, Ms. Peters?
Why do I think it is? I mean, I think it's
starts with an R, or it starts with a C.
Control.
Nope. Capitalism and racism. So those are the two things. That's why we think it is. So
I mean, yeah, I was gonna say money would be the.
There you go. No, I mean, look, I think we underestimate how much money comes out of the gun manufacturing, the gun industry, like how big of an industry they are. I really think we underestimate that. And it didn't really hit me until I was actually doing work in Mexico. And in Mexico, they're dealing with a huge surge in gun violence, right? And the first instinct is, the cartel, it's drugs. But when we looked at this, when we talked to the leaders there, they said 70% of the guns that are coming to Mexico are coming from America. We are literally supplying Mexico. We are literally like exporting all the firearms that are increasing this crazy homicide, gun violence surge in Mexico. It's like the gun violence crisis in America has now spread from beyond our country, and we're profiting off of it legally profiting off of it. This is a huge business. And I think we cannot underestimate America's commitment to capitalism and commitment to funds and resources. Now, what I will say that offsets that, and this is a big thing that we've been very clear about, and we've been very successful in Congress and with the White House on, is that, yes, somebody loud here. What we've also been able to share is that, yes, firearms in the gun industry is big business, but the cost of violence is a very heavy load. And in America, every year, our economy loses $557 billion to gun violence. And so, yes, there is an industry that's thriving, but our overall economy is suffering. And when we can start to talk in that language, we start to really break through, especially to those who don't care as much about the health toll, but maybe care about the future of their economy. So I think that's one big thing. And I think the second thing with the R thing, I'll just pick it on you because you asked a question. But with the racism piece, it's not just, what we've seen is that it's not racism in a sense of trying to hold a community back per se, or manipulate or benefit off of them. What we've seen is that what's the real way racism is playing out as it pertains to gun violence is that they're over criminalizing our communities and they're over criminalizing individuals. And you can watch it, and it's really the media that's driving it. But when you look at how gun violence is portrayed in Black and brown communities, it is only portrayed as a crime problem. If a mass shooting happens in the suburbs of Montgomery County, Maryland, right now, sorry, somebody walked across the street like, yeah, I agree. Right, bro. He's like, yeah, I agree. If that happened in Montgomery County, Maryland, you would know everything about the kids. You know everything about the parents. You know everything about the shooter. You know everything about the shooter, where they came from. You would hear about their mental health condition. If they were bullied in school, you would hear the full picture. But if a mass shooting happened in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is the blacker side of Maryland, they would have literally told you nothing. They would have gave you a body toll, a body count. You would have saw maybe a mugshot, some yellow tape, and that would have been the end of the story. And they would have just wrote it off as another criminal activity versus a situation that maybe had some other indicators or other reasons for what happened. And that criminalization of our people is a huge problem. I don't really know how to best explain it. It happened to me when I was shot as a bystander. When I arrived at the hospital, before I could talk to my surgeons, my nurses, my doctors, you know who opened the doors and engaged me when I first was rolled into the emergency room? Was investigators. And they questioned me. What'd you do with the drugs? Where's the gun? Why were you there? I was like, I'm a bystander. What do you mean? And they questioned me. I'm literally bleeding to death. I had to go through 3 rounds of investigation before I could even meet my surgeon, who saved my life. He only had 24 minutes left based on blood loss and saved my life. But I spent at least 15 minutes talking to investigators and proving my innocence in the hospital bed with my leg blown half off. You know what I mean? And that happens every single day in Black communities. We are criminalizing our hospitals. We are criminalizing the courtrooms. We're criminalizing media, and we're criminalizing the policy. And so I think that is why we're seeing this different level of accountability on individuals in Black and brown communities versus the gun dealers sitting out in the suburbs or in rural, wherever, who are just a good old small business. So anyway, I know it's a little harsh, but I think that's why I really think we're seeing it play out the way it is. And I do think it will change, but it's only going to change when we hold people accountable and we call them out for these breakdowns in their approaches.
Thank you. I definitely agree with you. And I don't know, Gary, if you have any comments or if you have any thoughts about what the idea of progress means to you, what that might look like.
And we do have increasing amount of data about what works. And I think that's really important, that we take a science-based approach to what works. And what you see across the country is that states that regulate more aggressively, that have better background check systems, that do supervise gun dealers, that require guns be registered so they can be traced, all those things contribute to a decrease in gun violence. So places like Massachusetts, Hawaii, to some extent, California, New Jersey, Maryland, places that are regulating have lower numbers of homicides and other gun deaths per capita. And I do think that the solutions almost all right now have to start at the state and local level. I think it's very, very frustrating to advocate, given the way Congress is structured and especially in the Senate, to advocate for gun violence prevention solutions at a national level, and that it's the states that have to be incubators and establish what works. And hopefully, and I'm crossing my fingers here, as things are demonstrated to work, they'll be picked up and incorporated in more states until the logic of them becomes too forceful to ignore at the national level. And it's a long-term strategy. It isn't going to fix the problem overnight. But I think there's some hope that in the long run, making these important changes at the state level will lead to national change.
I think Renee Hopkins from Alliance for Gun Responsibility would agree with you, Gary, in that they were founded after the Sandy Hook incident, and their theory of change is more about how states lead the way. For them, they are working on having certain members of Congress elected to the state level that do support gun prevention initiatives and, have open platforms that relate to these sorts of circumstances that they work towards getting those sorts of politicians elected to their state level so they can enact those same sort of provisions towards other states like Michigan and other states in the Midwest. So when it comes to progress on the state and federal level, I know that we wanted to touch on the recent Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment that was ruled in June 2022, where it ruled that the Constitution provides a right to carry a gun outside of the home. And ultimately, what are your thoughts about the likely impacts of this case on gun violence on a local level?
And I think it's super sad that the Supreme Court is going to be an impediment to successful gun violence prevention. It's very clear that a majority of justices on the Supreme Court believe in a very broad set of rights under the Second Amendment. And it's really contrary to the text of the amendment. It's contrary to history, but it's something we can't ignore. And so what I think we'll see following that decision is an emboldened gun rights movement, meaning that they'll go back and challenge all of the state statutes that provide for gun violence prevention, and ask courts in various states to reevaluate what passes muster under this new decision. And the big problem with the decision, I'll try to describe it without getting too technically legal. The big problem with the decision is that it changes the rubric for how you evaluate whether the Second Amendment prevents a regulation from going into effect. And the way it does that is by eliminating any consideration, and this is shocking, really. The decision eliminates any consideration under the Second Amendment of what works. Because what the court said is, you can only look at history. You can't look at whether there was a sufficient justification in terms of lives saved by a restriction that impacts the Second Amendment. So just by way of example, I was in the Attorney General's office for the period of time where we were trying to implement our assault weapons ban. And we implemented it and really made the ban effective across the state. And then, of course, the NRA affiliated group in Massachusetts sued the state saying this assault weapons ban violates the Second Amendment, basically because the Second Amendment protects our right to carry whatever we want, wherever we want, whenever we want. We were able to beat that challenge back on the grounds that there was sufficient evidence that the assault weapons ban was necessary for public safety. And what the Bruin decision does, the recent Supreme Court decision does, is it takes away any evaluation by any court of the consequences of gun violence. So we would not have been able to defend the case the way we did before if it were brought today. We would not have been able to say it saves lives. And that's shocking, right? I mean, there's no way that courts should tell state governments they should stop being in the business of enacting gun regulations that save lives.
Thank you, Gary. Greg, any thoughts about this?
No, I mean, I think Gary's spot on. I think the only thing I will add is, unfortunately, in a lot of Black and brown communities, we're already saturated with firearms, and so this decision, which was very political and timed very politically too, we should also pay attention to that. As destructive as it is, it was a political move. And I think, honestly, it just reinforces the urgency of some of the public health strategies that we're pushing for, because unfortunately, politics may ebb and flow and firearms can flow into our communities. But we also can't forget that the lifespan of a firearm is 19 years, and so they may open the floodgates for 2, 3, 6 years, and maybe we get a better situation in Supreme Court and we return it, but now you have multiple generations that are suffering because of that. So I think it just reinforces the urgency of focusing on the public health strategies as aggressively as we do the access strategies.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I mean, you'll see some really cockamamie cases come down over these next few years. For example, there's clear that the NRA will challenge safe storage regulations. So, they're going to argue that the Second Amendment protects your right to, leave your gun, on the dining room table while you're going to the bathroom where your children can find it. And that's crazy. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense from any rational public policy perspective.
So thank you so much, both. I know that we're at time. I really want to thank you for your time today. I learned a lot. I hope that everyone in the session also learned from both of your experiences and with your personal experiences with gun violence as well. Thank you, Greg, for sharing your personal story that ultimately that makes a big impact on the fact that this is not only about stats and figures, and it's not only about what we read in the news or what we see online. It's a personal journey that one has to go through, that people are going through in the community. So thank you both for your time. I really appreciate it. Ultimately, this video is going to be posted on our YouTube channel in the next week. So we'll let you know when it is posted. And just please stay in touch and please contact us if you want to reach out to any of the panelists as well. I know that, Greg has a certain call to action with CG Action Fund. So Greg, if you want to quickly share what your call to action is and maybe Sherry as well, and then we can close for the day.
Let me go first because it seems like Greg's got some noise again.
No, I don't think that's me.
You're good. Go ahead.
I don't think that's me.
Okay, sorry. I thought it was you. Sorry, go ahead.
It's all good. If y'all can hear me, I just want to say there's 3 things that you can do. 1, educate yourselves on the crisis of gun violence, because what's being portrayed in the media is very flawed. And we actually rolled out a tool last week called the City Violence Prevention Index Report, that basically looked at the top 50 cities most impacted by violence and assessed what they're doing to reduce violence beyond policing. So I encourage you to check that out. If you go to our website, you'll see it, but it's the Violence Prevention Index Report, and look at those cities, see what they're doing, what they're not doing. And hey, feel free to call them out if they're not doing enough, or celebrate them if they're doing great. The second thing is donate or partner with organizations that are doing violence reduction. Every major city in the country has dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations that are working to reduce violence, whether that's intervention, whether that's hospital-based, whether that's community-based. And many of them are under-supported, under-resourced, and frankly, they need your dollars and they need volunteer support. So I encourage you to do that. And then lastly, we really got to be more aggressive at budget advocacy. A lot of our advocacy is focused around laws and policies, but we're overlooking the urgency and the importance of budget advocacy. And a true public health response to gun violence is really 90% money, 10% legislation and laws. And so that means we all got to be smarter about what type of advocacy we do towards our mayors, towards our county, towards our state legislators and our governors to make sure they're putting their dollars into strategies that save lives and not just building another bridge or not just building another blah, 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 blah. But if they really care about saving lives, there are real programs that exist that worked that in most states are being under-resourced. So those are my three things. And thank you so much. And I apologize, I do have to jump here, but thank you again, Shivani, and everyone in Impactionable.
Thank
I
you,
have a
Brad.
quick question. I have a quick question for him. Oh, are you? Is it going to be on the blog? Or you said something about a blog. Is that going to be the YouTube thing about what you like wrote about, or a book or whatever? That be on the blog? What you talked about in the beginning?
I'll share that with Shivani and I defer to her.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Have a safe weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Gary, I'm going to end with your call to action and we'll close for the night.
Yeah, real quickly, the two things. One is don't look away. It's so easy for people to just put their hands over their eyes and to stop paying attention to these problems. It's easy to say, this doesn't happen in my neighborhood, or it's not going to happen in my neighborhood. And there's two reasons you shouldn't do that. One is, we're all neighbors at some level. Everybody is in the same neighborhood in our society at this point. And second, it can happen in your neighborhood. The fact that it hasn't doesn't mean it won't. And second, get involved, get active, find a gun violence prevention organization that has values consistent with yours and put some time and effort. And as Greg said, put some money into it. I just wrote a piece for the Violence Policy Center, which is essentially a list of 50 things that could happen at the state level that would make all of us safer. And that's going to be published in the next couple of weeks. So go through that and see if there are ideas that make sense for you to recommend to your state legislature to advocate, because every little thing makes a difference. It's the combination of regulations and laws that ultimately make us safer. And so figure out what makes sense to you and what makes sense in your community, and try to get it implemented. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening to us. And it is nice to see so many people turning out after work hours for a program like this. Thank
you. Thank you, Gary, so much for your time, and completely agree. Every little action makes a big difference. So we appreciate everyone joining us tonight, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your night. Stay safe out there.
Take care.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bye now.
Bye.